Hello, me again. How are you? Hope you're all doing well. If you're still here, giving me a chance, thank you. If you're not, well, thank you for giving it a go anyway. Welcome to Bloodline, episode 3. We have a sheep nearby. Today is that. Before we begin, let's say this plainly. This episode is not doctrine. It is not theology. It is not science. It is not a lesson in what to believe. What you're about to hear is a descent. Not into conspiracy, but into memory. The kind that was buried on purpose. We'll be stitching this episode together from ancient texts, oral myths, forbidden scrolls, half-burned fragments, and stories that slipped through the cracks of official truth. Some of it will sound eerily familiar. Some of it may scratch against everything you were taught. And some of it, well, was never supposed to be spoken aloud. And that's exactly why we're speaking it. I am not here to preach, not here to convert, and I am not here to argue. I'm just here to pull on the forbidden threads woven beneath every origin myth and invite you to wonder where they lead. Today, we're not just asking questions. We're stepping into the fracture itself. One of the oldest, most buried, and most deliberately raised cracks in the whole story. You see, we've been handed a very tidy sequence. The creation, the garden, the serpent, the fall, the exile, the flood, the rainbow. Neat, clean, wrapped with a moral at the end. But beneath those sanitized Sunday school verses, beneath the golden arcs and bedtime retellings, there are fractures, cracks in the story, cracks big enough to swallow heaven. Because this isn't the tale of a man who disobeyed in a garden. This is the tale of beings who disobeyed the sky. This is what came before the flood, before the ark, before giants walked the earth, or prophecy ever took its first breath. This is the story of when heaven came down and touched what it was never meant to touch. And what came down changed everything. We've reached the fracture, the quiet rupture they never explained. Genesis chapter 6. Just 4 verses, but the weight of them pulls the entire mythos into question. Because this isn't a chapter. It's a warning. It's a wound. And no one ever told you what it really said. Verse 1 and 2. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives, of all which they chose. No commentary, no clarification, just divine beings took human wives, moving on. And then suddenly in verse 5, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. By verse 6, it repented the Lord that he had made man. And by verse 7, I will destroy man and beast and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air. And by verse 12, the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way. All flesh, not just humans, all. Something is missing, because the story skips the cause. It tells you there's a problem, but not what the problem was. It gives you consequences without a crime. The destruction of all life, man, woman, animal, creeping thing, is announced. But the reason? Compressed, condensed, coded. You get a divine human union and then a flood. That's not a story. That's a seal. Genesis 6 wasn't written to tell you everything. It was written to mark something that was once told, but no longer allowed to be. This is what it sounds like when a memory is preserved under pressure. This is what theology looks like when fear of the truth forces redaction. The sons of God came down. The daughters of men bore children. The world changed, and all were given, and the earth was corrupt. You see, the early biblical texts weren't written in a vacuum. They were stitched together over generations, from stories older than ink. Some verses were allowed to speak. Some were silenced. Others were flattened into whispers. And this tiny fracture in Genesis 6 is one of the most compressed codes in all of Scripture. It's the skeleton of a story that once thundered, a story the ancients remembered clearly, but scribes only left in traces. To understand it, we have to go back to a scroll that once was cherished, then hidden, and then banned. A scroll that was never meant for Sunday school. The Book of Enoch. According to 1st Enoch, long before the flood, long before the ark, long before the judgment, there were watchers. Angelic beings, sent not to interfere, but to observe. They were guardians, custodians, bound to watch, not touch. But they watched for too long. Among them stood Semjahaza, as you say it, their leader. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't reckless. He knew what crossing the boundary meant. 1st Enoch chapter 6, verse 3. I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. But the others, they agreed, and so they bound themselves, not just in intention, but in oath. In the verse 4 it says, let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual curses. They descended to a mountain that would become a scar in the sky, Mount Hermon, where they made the pact, where they renamed the place after their sin. Hermon means the mountain of the oath, because on it they had sworn and bound themselves with curses. There were 20 captains, 200 in all. Among them, Azazel, who would teach the secrets of metal, mirrors, and vanity. Kokabiel, the star mapper. Sariel, the moon watcher. Armaros, the curse breaker. And Semjaza, the one who knew better and fell anyway. This was not seduction. This was not weakness. This was a ritualized rebellion. They made the decision together, swore it together, and descended together. They chose earth. They chose flesh. They chose union. And what they touched would never be the same again. Because from the moment they fell, everything began to unravel, and later generations, terrified what this meant, would try to explain it away. We've reached the line that makes most scholars sweat, because while Genesis barely breathes these two words on verse 2, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The implications beneath that line were too dangerous to leave untouched, and so the system gave us a theory. It's often called the Sethite theory. You may have heard it in Sunday school. You may have read it in footnotes. You may have never even realized it was a theory, because it was handed down as if it were simply true. The sons of God? They were simply the descendants of Seth, the righteous, godly line. The daughters of men? Oh, those were the daughters of Cain, the wicked, cursed bloodline. The problem? A little spiritual intermarriage, a little moral compromise, the pure line mingling with the corrupt. And that, supposedly, is what brought about the flood. It's simple, it's clean, it's harmless, and most importantly, it's safe. Because what this interpretation does, brilliantly by the way, is sanitize Genesis 6. It removed the supernatural entirely. No angels, no hybrids, no watchers, no Nephilim. Just humans marrying other humans and God getting upset about it. And yet, this neat explanation is not ancient. It's not even particularly old. It does not come from Moses. It does not come from the earliest Jewish scribes. It certainly does not come from the authors who originally told these stories. This version only truly gained traction in the 4th and 5th centuries Common Era. It was church fathers like Augustine of Hippo, Julius Africanus, and others who began pushing the Sethite theory into dominance. Why? Because by then the early church had become deeply uncomfortable with its own inherited mythology. You see, by the 4th century, the church was no longer a group of scattered followers. It had power. It had government backing. It was aligning with empire. It was becoming an institution. And institutions don't like messy origin stories. They don't like unmanageable supernatural beings. They don't like divine rebels mating with human women. Hybrid bloodlines, fallen divine beings, a rebellion that might implicate powers greater than man. That was dangerous territory. It undermined the controlled vertical hierarchy they were constructing. God, church, priesthood, man, woman. Anything that blurred that chain, like angels stepping into human roles, threatened the structure. And so the story was flattened. The watchers were slowly erased. The Nephilim became metaphors. The hybrid unions, quietly discarded. Instead, we were given the Sethite lens, one that allowed the institutions to speak about sin and morality, without ever touching the more uncomfortable contamination of bloodlines that the ancient world was actually describing. But go back earlier, before Augustine, before Constantine, before church fathers sanitized the text, you'll find something very different, because the original readers of Genesis 6 didn't blink at the idea of divine beings crossing into flesh. They fully understood what the text was saying, because they still carried the older, unedited versions of the story, versions that we'll now walk straight into. The version that speaks openly of what the sons of God truly were, the Watchers. The church may have handed us a clean version, but the ancients, they didn't flinch. They never once imagined that the sons of God were simply Seth's children dating Cain's daughters. They knew exactly what Genesis 6 was referencing. The original Hebrew uses the phrase B'nai ha-Elohim, sons of God, not sons of Seth, not righteous men, sons of God. And in every other place this phrase appears in Scripture, it refers to divine beings. We see it in the Book of Job, chapter 1, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. These are heavenly beings, spiritual entities, participants in the divine council. The same council seen repeatedly in ancient Jewish and Near Eastern texts, where multiple levels of divine beings operate under the Most High. In fact, even outside the Bible, this view dominated ancient understanding. The earliest Jewish commentaries, writings, and oral traditions were crystal clear. The sons of God in Genesis 6 were angels, specifically the group known as the Watchers. You'll find this exact account preserved in the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even some early Christian and rabbinic traditions before later suppression. In the ancient world, this wasn't conspiracy. This was simply common knowledge. The Watchers were heavenly beings assigned to observe mankind, but they didn't stay in their place. And that crossing of boundaries, heaven descending into flesh, is one of the oldest taboos embedded into countless mythologies across human history. Because once you open that door, you're not just talking about angels anymore. You're talking about hybrids, about contamination, about lines of blood that carry something they were never meant to carry. You see, for the ancients, Genesis 6 wasn't a mystery. The rebellion of the Watchers was widely understood as one of the most catastrophic fractures in early human existence. A divine crime that didn't just corrupt men, but corrupted the entire world order. The more you study the older versions of the story, the more you realize how deliberately it was pushed out of later doctrine. Because once the church fully institutionalized power, this story became too dangerous to allow. Divine beings stepping outside their roles, breaking cosmic law, defying hierarchy, interbreeding with humanity, creating hybrid lines that were powerful, violent, and out of control. That narrative doesn't serve empires. It unravels the stability they need. Because if the Watchers were real, and their hybrids walked the earth, then the bloodlines of power might not just be political, they might be biological. And once you ask that question, the rest of history begins to tremble. But before we go there, let's step fully into their descent, into the rebellion itself, into what the Watchers did, and what they birthed. Because this is where the true story of Genesis 6 actually begins. Now we enter the fracture itself. The part Genesis only whispers, the part Enoch dares to tell. Because before the floodwaters rose, before Noah built the ark, before giants took the land, there was a moment, a decision, a rebellion. The Watchers were not random angels. They were appointed. Their task? To watch over humanity, to observe, to guide but not interfere. They were in essence guardians of the boundary, but they broke it. And according to the Book of Enoch, it wasn't just one or two, it was 200. 200 beings from the heavenly host, and their leader, Semjaza. Can you imagine what, I have this picture in my head of just beings falling into the earth. Just ping, ping, ping. No, just me? Probably. Anyway. Enoch chapter 6, verse 3. And Semjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. So they swore an oath, an unbreakable pact. Where? In Mount Hermon, a place still whispered about today, the mountain that sits on the northern boundary of ancient Israel and Syria. The very mountain whose name means the mountain of the oath. They bound themselves together under that oath, so that none could betray the others once the descent began. And then they fell. They crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, between spirit and flesh. And what did they desire? Human women. They didn't simply visit. They didn't appear in visions. They took wives. They entered into physical unions with human women, blending realms never meant to touch. And from those unions came the Nephilim, the hybrids, the giants, the children of forbidden union. But the Watchers didn't stop there. Their rebellion wasn't limited to lust. It was also about knowledge, forbidden knowledge, the kind humanity was never meant to possess. Azazel taught men how to craft weapons, the making of swords and knives and shields and breastplates. Amazarak taught enchantments and sorcery, the first threads of pharmakeia, not just herbs or potions, but the manipulation of nature itself, the bending of plant medicine into control, mixing ritual, alchemy, and mind-altering substances. A pharmakon, both poison and cure, depending on who controls it. Barakiel taught astrology, divining the heavens. Kokabiel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught cloud signs, the hidden arts of weather and divination. The Watchers injected unnatural knowledge into humanity, a technology of power, a technology of corruption. And as humanity learned these forbidden arts, violence erupted, the earth fell into chaos. War, sorcery, bloodshed, cannibalism, abominations. The Nephilim themselves grew monstrous, their appetites insatiable. Enoch chapter 7, verse 5 and 6. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. The world wasn't just corrupt, it was mutating. All flesh, man, animal, even creation itself, was being altered. The Watchers had unleashed a biological and spiritual contamination, one that reached into the very fabric of life. The heavens could no longer remain silent, because once the Watchers crossed the line, a second rebellion threatened to unfold beneath them, and so judgment descended. The children were born. The forbidden unions of the Watchers produced something humanity had never seen, and was never meant to see. The Nephilim, from the Hebrew root Nephal, meaning to fall, the fallen ones, or sometimes translated as giants. But these were not merely large men. This was not simple height. The Nephilim were the living evidence of cosmic rebellion, a fusion of heaven's power with human flesh. Their very existence was unnatural. They grew in size, they grew in strength, and they grew in hunger. The Book of Enoch describes them consuming the earth's resources until nothing could satisfy them. In Enoch chapter 7 verse 2, we read, "And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells." That's not simply tall, that's something else entirely, a hybrid monstrosity. And when the resources ran dry, they turned on everything else. On verse 5 and 6, "And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood." I feel like I have already said this. They weren't just destroying humanity, they were devouring creation itself. And this is where the corruption spiraled beyond repair, because this wasn't simply violence, this was contamination. The interbreeding had not just birthed the Nephilim, it had altered genetics. It began to affect all flesh. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 12, "And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth." All flesh, not just humans, animals, birds, beasts, even creeping things. The entire fabric of life was unraveling. What began as lust became contamination. What began as desire became mutation. The Watchers had not only defied divine boundaries, they had destabilized creation itself. They altered reproduction, they altered genetics, they introduced forbidden technologies that blurred the lines between species, between orders, between realms. And once you see that, the reason for the flood no longer sounds like a simple punishment for wicked behavior. It becomes something else entirely. A full-spectrum purge. Not of sin, but of corrupted code. This wasn't just about sin. It was about contamination, a kind of biological infection spreading across creation. The Nephilim were not the only hybrids created. The corruption seeped into everything else. Modified animals, mutated species, chimeric creatures whispered about in the oldest mythologies. Maybe that's when, the dinosaurs came up. Huh? Oh my god. Yes, this one just popped like that. Maybe that's how the dinosaurs and dragons, who said dinosaurs are real? I can say dragons are real. And maybe those dragons, dinosaurs, were a consequence of these hybrid mutations, of this contamination in the earth. Wow. I don't know, this is just me thinking. You might not agree. Again, it's all good. That's what we're here for. And even as humanity was losing control of its own world, the Watchers kept feeding humanity more knowledge. How to master weather, how to manipulate stars, how to control medicine and sorcery, how to command life itself. The world was no longer recognizable. The earth was no longer what had been spoken into existence. It had become something else, something unstable, something dangerously out of balance. And that's when the heavens finally moved. Judgment could no longer be delayed. The Watchers would face their reckoning. The Nephilim would be erased. But as you'll see, some echoes refused to die quietly. The corruption was complete. Creation itself had been infected. The world that once reflected divine order now mirrored chaos. The Watchers had broken the boundaries between realms. The Nephilim had devoured everything in sight. The animals, the land, the skies, all twisted. And still the hunger grew. But heaven had been watching. What the Watchers forgot was that their rebellion had not gone unnoticed. Above their secret pacts, above their mountains of oath, above their corrupted bloodlines, the archangels remained. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, the enforcers of divine law, the guardians of the original design. When the Watchers crossed the boundary, these were the ones dispatched to restore balance. Their orders were absolute. No debate, no second chances. The Watchers had contaminated creation. Their punishment would be permanent. Book of Enoch, chapter 10, verse 12. Bind them for 70 generations under the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment. The Watchers were seized, stripped of their celestial authority, and chained, buried beneath the mountains, locked inside the deep places of the earth. The same earth they had defiled now became their prison. Azazel, one of the chief corruptors, received his own judgment. In chapter 10, verse 5 and 6. Bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudael, and cast him therein. A desolate wilderness of jagged rock, a pit beneath burning stones. Maybe that's where the idea of hell comes from. I mean, where did he just been cast? A desolate wilderness of jagged rock? A pit beneath burning stones? Yeah, hellfire. Azazel's name would echo through Yom Kippur's scapegoats, desert demons, and the first whispers of occult power. But even with the Watchers bound, their offspring, the Nephilim, remained. Their existence was an abomination. They were not part of the original design. They could not be allowed to continue. The only solution was eradication. The Nephilim would be wiped out, the corruption purged, the slate wiped clean. And so the flood was not merely an act of moral judgment. It was surgical, targeted, a genetic cleansing, a full reset of creation's compromised foundation. And in the midst of the purge, only one man remained untainted. Genesis chapter 6 verse 9. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. Yep. Perfect in his generations. Not just righteous, but uncorrupted. What that means is anyone's guess. And so the ark was built. The floodwaters rose, and the world drowned. The Watchers were silenced, the Nephilim destroyed, the corruption washed away, or so it seemed. Because even after the waters receded, the echoes of their crime would not fully disappear. Their bloodlines somehow survived. The flood came, the rain fell, the waters swallowed the earth, the world reset, restored to its uncorrupted state. At least that's the version we are told. Because almost as soon as the ark settles, as soon as Noah's descendants begin to multiply again, the giants return. The flood was supposed to erase them, but the giants never really drowned. In the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 33, and there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, which come of the Nephilim, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. The very same word, Nephilim. Not metaphor, not rumour. The bloodline had survived. In the book of Deuteronomy, as Israel prepares to enter the land, the Rephaim, or Rephaim, as you say it, stand there, giants. The Anakim, giants. The Zamzumim, giants. The Emim, giants. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 20 and 21. That was also accounted a land of giants. Giants dwelt therein in old time, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. The bloodlines echo, the sons of Anak, Og of Bashan, as you say it, whose bed was made of iron to hold his enormous size. Goliath, whose towering form would face David centuries later. In 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 4, and there went out a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. The question now becomes unavoidable. How? How did these bloodlines persist after the flood? We are never given a full explanation. Scripture leaves it hanging, but the possibilities are impossible to ignore. Were some wives aboard the ark already carrying contaminated blood? Had some hybrids survived in isolated regions untouched by the flood? Was there a second incursion, a second rebellion after the flood waters receded? The text is silent. The giants are not. Because across Canaan, across ancient lands, across every early civilization, the claim of divine ancestry only grew bolder. The bloodlines were no longer seen as shameful contamination. They became something else entirely, a claim to authority. Kings, priests, pharaohs, emperors, all began invoking divine ancestry as their birthright. I rule because my blood is not entirely human. In Egypt, the pharaohs were literal sons of gods, horrors incarnate. In Mesopotamia, kings traced their lines to the Anunnaki, the gods who once descended. In Canaan, tribes feared and revered the giants as half-divine warlords. Even in early European monarchies, divine right of kings echoes this ancient claim. The very corruption that once triggered the flood became the justification for rulership. This is where the story becomes more uncomfortable, because if the Nephilim bloodline survived and were intentionally preserved, then much of human power may be built on foundations that are hybrid, not fully human. And the further you follow these bloodlines into history, the closer they come to present-day institutions, monarchies, religious orders, secret societies. The bloodlines never truly disappeared. They simply put on crowns. Because while forbidden unions corrupted the blood, patriarchal hands rewrote the stories. The forbidden bloodlines survived, and while they were preserved in power, something far more deliberate was happening in the shadows. The erasure of the feminine. That's where we're heading next. But the truth is, we could stay here for a while. We could keep unraveling the fractures inside the Genesis origin story, the cracks in Eden, in Cain, in the Watchers, in the Nephilim, in the survival of bloodlines after the flood. And we will, because these threads aren't finished. I said it from the very beginning. We're not doing this in a straight line. Because as I was pulling apart these ancient threads, other stories began surfacing. Stories that sit quietly beside these origins, but were never handed to you. Stories that were erased long before you were ever allowed to ask these questions. Not just about who ruled, but about who existed, who mattered, who was allowed to speak, who was allowed to remain. The Bible you were handed, like so many other sacred texts, was not neutral. It was built and rebuilt under systems of power. And whenever power rewrites origins, the first thing it removes is the woman's voice. And so, we arrive at the ones who were erased and then demonized. Again, I really hope you guys enjoy listening to my wild journeys into these threads. And if you do, please do come by on TikTok at wildlywoven279. Just say hi. Just let me know if it's sounding okay, if you're enjoying the stories, or is there something that has been bugging you and you would like me to open it up? I mean, that's what I'm here for. I will see you next time. Bye.